In this video lesson, we'll discuss the South in the Age of Industry and the impact of America's Second Industrial Revolution on the United States. The industrial wave that washed over the North after the Civil War caused only feeble ripples in the backwater of the South. As late as 1900, the South still produced a smaller percentage of the nation's manufactured goods that it had before the Civil War. The plantation system had degenerated into a pattern of absentee land ownership. White and black sharecroppers now tilled the soil for a share of the crop and became tenant farmers, in bondage to their landlords, who controlled needed credit and supplies. Southern agriculture received a welcome boost in the 1880s when machine-made cigarettes replaced the roll-your-own variety and tobacco consumption shot up. James Duke took full advantage of the new technology to mass produce, and in 1890 he absorbed his main competitors into the American Tobacco Company. Industrialists tried to coax the agricultural South out of the fields and into the factories, but only with modest success. The region remained overwhelmingly rural. Prominent among the boosters of a new South was Henry Grady, editor of the Atlanta Constitution. He exhorted the ex-Confederates to outplay the North at the commercial and industrial game. But there were many obstacles that lay in the path of Southern industrialization. One was the paper barrier of regional rate-setting systems imposed by the Northern-dominated railroad interests. Railroads gave preferential rates to Northern goods. They discriminated in favor of Southern raw materials. The net effect was to keep the South in a kind of third-world servitude to the Northeast, as a supplier of raw materials to the manufacturing metropolis, unable to develop an industrial base. A bitter example of this economic discrimination against the South was the Pittsburgh Plus pricing system in the steel industry. Rich deposits of coal and iron ore near Birmingham, Alabama, should have given steel manufacturers the competitive edge. But the steel lords of Pittsburgh brought pressure to bear on the compliant railroads. This stunted the South's natural economic advantages and throttled the growth of the steel industry. In manufacturing cotton textiles, the South fared considerably better. Beginning about 1880, Northern capital began to erect cotton mills in the South, largely in response to tax benefits and the prospect of cheap and non-unionized labor. The textile mills provided a mixed blessing to the economically blighted South. They slowly wove an industrial thread into the fabric of Southern life. But there was a human cost. Cheap labor was the South's major attraction for potential investors, and keeping labor cheap became a religion in the South among Southern industrialists. Rural Southerners, mostly white, poured out of the hills and hollows to seek employment in the hastily erected company mill towns. Entire families worked from dawn to dusk amid whirring spindles, and they were paid half the rate of their northern counterparts. But despite depressed working conditions and poor pay, many Southerners saw employment in the mills as a salvation, the first steady jobs and wages they had ever known. So mill work offered farm fugitive families their chance to remain together. Economic miracles wrought during the decades after the Civil War enormously increased the wealth of the Republic. The standard of living rose sharply, and well-fed American workers enjoyed more physical comforts than counterparts in any other nation. Urban centers mushroomed as the insatiable factories demanded more American labor, and immigrants swarmed in like honeybees to the new jobs. As agriculture declined in relation to manufacturing, America could no longer aspire to be a nation of small, freehold farms. Jefferson's concepts of free enterprise were out. Rural American migrants and peasant European immigrants, used to living by the languid clock of nature, now had regiment to their lives by the factory whistle. Probably no single group was more profoundly affected by the new industrial age than women. Propelled into industry by recent inventions, chiefly the typewriter and the telephone switchboards, millions discovered new economic and social opportunities. For middle-class women, careers often meant delayed marriages and smaller families. Most women workers toiled neither for independence nor for glamour, but out of economic necessity. William earned less than men in the workplace. The clattering machine age accentuated class division as well. Industrial buccaneers flaunted bloated fortunes, and such extravagances evoked bitter criticism. Some of it was envious, but much of it rose from a group of socialists or other radicals. A nation of farmers and independent producers was becoming a nation of wage earners. In 1860, half of all workers were self-employed. By the century end, 2/3 were receiving wages for their work. Real rate wages were rising and times were good for workers who were working, but with dependence on wages came vulnerability to the swings of the economy and the employer. Nothing more sharply defined the growing difference between working class and middle class conditions of life than the precariousness of the labor's lot. Reformers struggled to introduce a measure of security, job, and unemployment into the working class. Strong pressures for foreign trade developed as the industrial machine threatened to saturate the domestic market, and American products began to radiate out all over the world. We'll discuss more about the changing lives of the American worker in our lessons in class.